The morning sun filtered through the elegant windows of Rosewood Café, casting long shadows across the polished marble floors. In the corner booth, a man sat alone, his weathered hands wrapped around a simple white coffee cup. Ezekiel Morrison. Zeke, to those who knew him, kept his eyes downcast, acutely aware of the sideways glances and hushed conversations that seemed to follow him wherever he went. His prosthetic leg, visible beneath worn denim, caught the light as he shifted uncomfortably in his seat. The military-issued jacket he wore had seen better days, its fabric faded from countless washes, but it was clean and carried the weight of memories he couldn't quite shake. Around him the cafe buzzed with the morning rush of Washington, D.C.'s elite politicians, lobbyists, and socialites who treated this upscale establishment as their second home. "Excuse me, sir?" The voice cut through the ambient chatter like a blade. Cordelia Vance, the cafe's manager, stood beside his table with her arms crossed, her perfectly manicured nails tapping against her silk blouse. Her expression was a carefully constructed mask of professional courtesy, but her eyes held something colder. Zeke looked up, his hazel eyes meeting hers with quiet dignity. "Yes, ma'am? I'm afraid I'm going to have to ask you to finish your coffee and move along. You're making some of our regular customers uncomfortable." The words hung in the air like smoke from a snuffed candle. Zeke's jaw tightened almost imperceptibly, but his voice remained steady. "I'm a paying customer, ma'am, just like everyone else." 3 years ago, Zeke had been Staff Sergeant Morrison, leading a patrol through the dusty streets of Kandahar. The morning had started like any other. Equipment checks, briefings, the familiar weight of his rifle across his chest. He remembered the children who would wave from doorways, the elderly men who nodded respectfully as his unit passed. Then came the explosion. The IED had been buried beneath a pile of construction debris, carefully concealed and waiting. In the split second between hearing the click of the trigger and feeling the world explode around him, Zeke had managed to push 2 of his men to safety. The blast had taken his left leg below the knee and left him with injuries that would never fully heal. But those 2 soldiers had gone home to their families because of his quick thinking. Now, sitting in this pristine cafe with its crystal chandeliers and imported Italian coffee machines, those memories felt like they belonged to someone else. The transition from military life to civilian existence had been brutal. The VA hospital stays, the physical therapy, the job interviews that ended with polite rejections, all of it had led him here, to this moment, where he was being asked to leave a public establishment for the crime of looking different. It had been 13 years, and 4 of the 13 months of the attack. Usually he would feel some kind of relief for the crime of looking different. It had been 13 years, and 4 of the 13 months of the attack. 4 J. Matthews to leave the public establishment for the crime of looking. The Rosewood Café occupied the ground floor of a historic building in downtown D.C., its reputation built on exclusivity and discretion. The clientele included senators' wives, Fortune 500 executives, and diplomatic attachés who appreciated the establishment's unspoken policy of maintaining a certain atmosphere. The walls were adorned with original artwork, and the menu featured items that cost more than Zeke's disability check covered in a week. But today, he had scraped together enough money for a simple pleasure: a cup of black coffee and a blueberry muffin. He'd counted the bills twice before entering, making sure he could afford both items plus a modest tip. The money was wrinkled and worn, pulled from various pockets and savings jars, but it was legal tender just the same. "Sir, I understand you've purchased something," Cordelia continued, her voice taking on a more insistent tone. "But surely you can understand that we have a certain clientele here. People who expect a particular environment when they're conducting business." Zeke's fingers tightened around his coffee cup. He could feel the eyes of other customers on him now, their conversations dying as they turned to watch this uncomfortable scene unfold. A woman in a Chanel suit whispered something to her companion, who nodded knowingly. A man in a $1,000 suit looked over the rim of his newspaper with barely concealed disdain. "I'm not bothering anyone," Zeke said quietly. "I'm just trying to drink my coffee in peace. Your appearance is disruptive." And frankly, some of our patrons have expressed concern about the atmosphere your presence creates." The word atmosphere hit Zeke like a physical blow. He thought about the atmosphere of the desert, where the air tasted of sand and fear, where the only thing that mattered was watching your battle buddy's back. He thought about the atmosphere of the VA hospital, where broken men and women fought daily battles that no one else could see. In the far corner of the cafe, an elderly woman named Margot Blackwood sat nursing her third cup of tea. She'd been coming to Rosewood for 15 years, ever since her husband's passing, and she'd never seen anything quite like this. Her keen eyes, sharp despite her 78 years, took in every detail of the unfolding drama. She recognized something in the young man's posture, in the way he held himself with dignity despite the obvious discomfort of the situation. "Ma'am," Zeke said, his voice carrying the measured tone of someone who had learned to control his emotions under extreme circumstances, "I served 3 tours in Afghanistan. I lost my leg defending the freedom that allows you to run this establishment. I'm not asking for special treatment. Just the same respect you'd show any other customer." Cordelia's expression hardened. "I'm sorry for your service, truly I am. But I have a business to run, and I cannot have customers who make other customers uncomfortable. This is a private establishment, and I reserve the right to refuse service to anyone based on what? My disability? My appearance? Because if that's the case, I'm pretty sure there are federal laws that might have something to say about that." The manager's cheeks flushed slightly. "Don't threaten me with lawsuits, sir. I'm simply asking you to be considerate of others." "Considerate?" Zeke's voice rose slightly, and he immediately caught himself, forcing his tone back to its measured calm. "I'm sitting quietly, drinking coffee, and bothering no one. If my presence here makes people uncomfortable, maybe they should ask themselves why." The conversation had now captured the attention of the entire cafe. Servers had stopped moving, their trays balanced in their hands as they watched the confrontation unfold. The usual morning soundtrack of clinking silverware and murmured conversations had been replaced by an uncomfortable silence. "I'm going to ask you one more time to finish your drink and leave," Cordelia said, her voice now carrying the authority of someone accustomed to having her way. "If you refuse, I'll have no choice but to call security." Zeke stared at her for a long moment, his mind racing. He thought about the times he'd been spat on by protesters when he first returned from overseas, about the job interviews where potential employers had seen his disability as a liability, about the countless small humiliations that had become part of his daily existence. He was tired, bone-deep tired, of fighting battles that shouldn't need to be fought. "Fine," he said quietly, reaching for his wallet. "I'll finish my coffee and go. But I want you to know that I bled for the right of every person in this room to sit here in freedom and comfort. I don't regret that sacrifice. But I do regret that some people can't see past their own prejudices to recognize basic human dignity." Cordelia's expression flickered for just a moment, as if his words had found their mark, but her resolve remained firm. "I'm sorry you feel that way, sir. But my decision stands." The security guard, a middle-aged man named Frank who had been working the building for 12 years, approached the table with obvious reluctance. He'd been watching the entire exchange from his position near the entrance, and everything about the situation made him uncomfortable. In his years of security work, he'd learned to read people, and everything about this veteran spoke of honor and integrity. "Sir," Frank said softly, "I'm going to have to ask you to come with me." Zeke nodded slowly, his shoulders sagging slightly under the weight of yet another defeat. He began to gather his things, his worn wallet, his keys, the small notebook where he sometimes wrote down his thoughts when the nightmares got too bad. The simple act of standing required effort, as his prosthetic leg had stiffened during the confrontation. "This is wrong," he said quietly, more to himself than to anyone else. "This is just wrong." Just as Zeke was about to follow Frank toward the exit, the cafe's front door burst open with unexpected force. The brass bell above it rang out sharply, and every head turned toward the entrance. A tall, athletic man in a dark suit strode in, his presence immediately commanding attention. His movements were precise, controlled, and spoke of years of training and discipline. Thaddeus Chen had been a Secret Service agent for 8 years, and he'd learned to read rooms instantly. But as his eyes swept across the cafe, taking in the tense atmosphere and the uncomfortable silence, he stopped short. His gaze landed on the man being escorted by security, and for a moment, time seemed to freeze. The military bearing, the haunted look in the eyes, the way he carried himself despite obvious physical limitations, it was all familiar. But it was the small scar above the left eyebrow that confirmed what Tad's mind was already processing. He'd seen that scar before, in a field hospital in Afghanistan, while he was recovering from his own injuries. Zeke? The name escaped his lips before he could stop it. The veteran turned, his eyes widening as he took in the well-dressed man striding toward him. Something about the voice, the way the man moved, triggered a memory that had been buried under years of pain and medication. Tad Chen? Zeke's voice was barely a whisper, but in the silence of the cafe it carried clearly. The Secret Service agent closed the distance between them in 3 quick strides, his professional demeanor giving way to something far more personal. "Jesus, Zeke, what are you doing here?" "What's going on?" Frank, the security guard, stepped back instinctively. He'd seen enough federal agents in his years of security work to recognize one when he saw one, and something about this man's presence had shifted the entire dynamic of the situation. "They're asking me to leave," Zeke said simply, his voice carrying the weight of someone who had grown accustomed to disappointment. "Apparently, I'm making the other customers uncomfortable." Tad's eyes flashed with something dangerous as he turned to face Cordelia, who had gone noticeably pale. "You're asking him to leave? Do you have any idea who this man is?" We have the right to refuse service to anyone," Cordelia stammered, but her earlier confidence had evaporated entirely. "This man," Tad said, his voice carrying the authority of someone accustomed to being obeyed, "is Staff Sergeant Ezekiel Morrison. He saved my life and the lives of 11 other soldiers during an ambush in Kandahar province 3 years ago." The cafe had gone completely silent now. Even the espresso machine seemed to have stopped its rhythmic hissing. Tad continued, his eyes never leaving Cordelia's face. "We were returning from a routine patrol when we got caught in a coordinated ambush. 3 vehicles, rocket-propelled grenades, small arms fire, the whole package. Our convoy was pinned down, and we were taking casualties. Sergeant Morrison, despite being wounded himself, managed to flank the enemy position and take out their primary weapons emplacement." Zeke shifted uncomfortably, unused to being the center of attention for positive reasons. "Tad, you don't need to—" "Yes, I do," Tad interrupted firmly. "The IED that took your leg went off when you were covering our withdrawal. You threw yourself on top of Private Henderson and Corporal Martinez to shield them from the blast. You saved their lives at the cost of your own mobility." The agent's voice grew thick with emotion as he continued. "I spent 3 weeks in the hospital next to you, Zeke. I watched you fight through infections, through surgeries, through pain that would have broken most men. And you never once complained. You never once asked, 'Why me?' You just focused on getting better, so you could take care of your soldiers." Margot Blackwood, the elderly woman who had been watching from her corner table, slowly rose to her feet. Her voice, when she spoke, was clear and strong despite her age. "My husband was a Marine," she said, her words carrying across the silent cafe. "He served in Vietnam. He never talked much about what he saw there, but he always said that you could tell a real warrior by how they carried themselves, especially when they were hurting." She walked slowly toward Zeke, her cane tapping against the marble floor. "I've been watching you, young man. I've seen how you hold yourself, how you treat the staff here with respect, even when you're not receiving it in return. I've seen how you count your money carefully, making sure you have enough to tip the server, even though you can barely afford your order." Tears had begun to form in her eyes. "My husband would have recognized you immediately. He would have been honored to buy you coffee, to shake your hand, to simply sit in your presence. And I am ashamed that you have been treated this way." in a country that owes you everything. The transformation in the cafe was remarkable. The businessman who'd been looking at Zeke with disdain slowly folded his newspaper and stood up. The woman in the Chanel suit was dabbing at her eyes with her napkin. Even the servers were standing at attention, their faces reflecting a mixture of shame and newfound respect. Cordelia, meanwhile, had gone from pale to ashen. Her hands shook slightly as she processed what she had just heard. I didn't know. I'm so sorry. I didn't realize." "That's the problem," Tad said, his voice gentler now but still firm. "You didn't know, and you didn't bother to find out. You saw someone who looked different, someone who might not fit your idea of what a customer should look like, and you decided he didn't belong." Zeke placed a hand on Tad's arm. "It's okay, brother. I'm used to it." "No, it's not okay," Tad replied firmly. "And you shouldn't have to get used to it. You served your country with honor, and you deserve to be treated with dignity and respect wherever you go." The Secret Service agent turned back to Cordelia, his expression serious but not unkind. "I want you to understand something. This man is a hero in the truest sense of the word. He didn't just serve his country. He sacrificed his body to save the lives of his fellow soldiers. He deserves better than what you've shown him today." Cordelia's composure finally cracked completely. Tears began to flow down her cheeks as the full weight of her actions hit her. "Mr. Morrison, I am so deeply sorry. I have no excuse for my behavior. There is no excuse for how I treated you." She paused, struggling to find the right words. "I was wrong, completely, utterly wrong. I let my own prejudices and assumptions cloud my judgment, and I treated a true American hero with disrespect and cruelty. I am ashamed of myself." The manager took a deep breath, composing herself slightly. "Please, Mr. Morrison, would you allow me to make this right? I'd like to offer you a standing invitation to this cafe. Your meals, your coffee, anything you want, it's on the house. Forever." Zeke looked around the cafe, taking in the faces of the other customers. Where there had been discomfort and disdain before, he now saw respect, admiration, and not a small amount of shame. The businessman approached him, extending his hand. "Sir, I owe you an apology as well. I judged you based on appearances, and that was wrong. Thank you for your service, and thank you for the sacrifices you made for all of us." One by one, other customers began to approach. The woman in the Chanel suit, the diplomatic attaché, even some of the younger professionals who had been absorbed in their phones. All of them came forward to shake Zeke's hand, to offer their thanks, to express their shame at how he had been treated. Tad watched with satisfaction as the cafe transformed from a place of exclusion to one of inclusion, from a space where Zeke had been made to feel unwelcome to one where he was clearly honored. But he also saw something else in his old friend's eyes. A wariness, a protection against hope that had been built up over years of disappointment. "Zeke," Tad said quietly, pulling him aside, "I want you to know something. What happened to you today, what's probably happened to you many times, it's not okay. But there are people who see you for who you really are. People who understand what you've sacrificed." The veteran nodded slowly, his throat tight with emotion. "I know, Tad. It gets hard sometimes. The looks, the assumptions, the constant feeling like I have to prove I belong somewhere. I didn't expect to run into you today, but I'm grateful I did." "I'm grateful too," Tad replied. "And I want you to know that this doesn't end here. I'm going to give you my card, and I want you to call me. Let's get together, catch up properly. I want to hear about your life, about how you're doing, about what you need." As the two men embraced, the cafe around them had taken on an entirely different atmosphere. Servers were approaching Zeke with genuine smiles, offering him fresh coffee and pastries. Other customers were engaging him in conversation, asking about his service, expressing their gratitude. Margot Blackwood had insisted on buying him lunch, and had already begun regaling him with stories of her late husband's military service. The simple act of one person recognizing another's worth had transformed not just a moment, but an entire community. In the space of 30 minutes, Zeke had gone from being an unwelcome outsider to being the most honored person in the room. As the morning wore on and the initial excitement died down, Zeke found himself sitting back in his original corner booth but now surrounded by new acquaintances. Tad had stayed as long as his schedule allowed, catching up on 3 years of separation and making plans for a proper reunion. Cordelia had personally served him a fresh cup of coffee and a slice of homemade pie, apologizing once again for her earlier behavior. "Mr. Morrison," she said as she placed the plate in front of him, "I hope you'll give us, a chance to show you the respect you deserve. I learned something important today about making assumptions and about what real service looks like." Zeke nodded, his guard finally beginning to lower. "We all make mistakes, Ms. Vance. What matters is what we do after we recognize them." As he sat there, surrounded by the warmth of newfound community and the respect he had always deserved, Zeke felt something he hadn't experienced in years, a sense of belonging. The cafe that had once felt like enemy territory now felt like home. The morning that had started with rejection and humiliation had transformed into something beautiful and redemptive. It was a reminder that heroes walk among us every day, often unrecognized and unappreciated, but no less heroic for their invisibility. It was a testament to the power of recognition, of seeing past surface appearances to the character beneath. But perhaps most importantly, it was a reminder that in a world that often seems divided and hostile, simple acts of respect and dignity can transform everything. One person's willingness to speak up, to recognize worth where others saw only difference, had changed not just one man's day, but an entire community's perspective. As Zeke finished his coffee and prepared to leave, he looked around the cafe one more time. The faces that had once regarded him with suspicion and disdain now looked at him with respect and admiration. The establishment that had tried to exclude him was now extending a permanent welcome, and the isolation that had defined so much of his civilian life had been replaced, at least for today, with the warmth of human connection. If this story has moved you, if it's reminded you to look beyond surface appearances and recognize the heroes walking among us, then share it with others. Like this video if it made you think differently about how we treat one another. Leave a comment about a time when you witnessed someone being misjudged, or when you realized you had misjudged someone yourself, and subscribe for more stories that celebrate the dignity and worth of every human being, because everyone has a story worth telling, and everyone deserves to be treated with respect. 3 weeks after the incident at Rosewood Café, the story had taken on a life of its own. What started as a simple confrontation between a disabled veteran and a cafe manager had become something much larger, a catalyst for change that rippled through the entire Washington, D.C. community. Zeke Morrison found himself in an unfamiliar position. He was becoming famous, not the kind of fame he had ever wanted or sought, but the kind that comes when ordinary people do extraordinary things and the world finally takes notice. The local news had picked up the story after several cafe patrons shared their experiences on social media, and it had quickly spread beyond the boundaries of the nation's capital. He stood in front of his bathroom mirror, adjusting the collar of a shirt that Chen had bought for him, a far cry from his usual military surplus attire. Today was different. Today, he was scheduled to speak at a veterans advocacy event at the Kennedy Center, something he never could have imagined 3 weeks ago. The transformation hadn't been easy. After years of struggling with invisibility and rejection, suddenly being thrust into the spotlight felt overwhelming. The phone calls from reporters, the interview requests, the invitations to speak at events, it was all foreign territory for someone who had grown accustomed to being overlooked. But there was purpose in it, something that gave meaning to the discomfort. Every interview, every speaking engagement, every shared story was an opportunity to shine light on the struggles faced by veterans returning home. It was a chance to give voice to the thousands of men and women who had served their country, only to find themselves fighting new battles on domestic soil. Dr. Patricia Holloway, a clinical psychologist who specialized in veteran affairs, had reached out to Zeke after reading about his story in the Washington Post. She had been working with returning veterans for 15 years, and she recognized something in his experience that went beyond a simple case of discrimination. What happened to you at that cafe, she explained during their first meeting, represents a microcosm of what many veterans face every day: the invisible wounds, the assumptions people make, the challenge of transitioning from a structured military environment to civilian life. It's all connected. Dr. Holloway had been advocating for better veteran services for years, but she had struggled to find a way to make the public understand the scope of the problem. Zeke's story provided a perfect example of how societal attitudes and assumptions could compound the already significant challenges faced by returning service members. "You've become a symbol," she told him, "not just of military service but of resilience, dignity, and the importance of looking beyond surface appearances. That's a powerful platform, and you have the opportunity to use it to help others." The idea both thrilled and terrified him. Speaking publicly about his experiences meant reopening wounds that had barely begun to heal. It meant reliving the trauma of combat, the pain of recovery, and the humiliation of countless rejections and dismissals. But it also meant giving voice to veterans who might never have the opportunity to tell their own stories. Meanwhile, Rosewood Café had undergone its own transformation. Cordelia Vance, the manager who had asked Zeke to leave, had not only kept her word about offering him free meals for life, she had gone much further. Working with local veteran organizations, she had established Heroes Table, a program that provided free meals to veterans and their families every Tuesday evening. The cafe had also become an unofficial meeting place for veterans in the D.C. area. What had once been an exclusive establishment catering only to the wealthy and powerful had opened its doors to a much broader community. The change hadn't been without its challenges. Some longtime customers had complained about the shift in atmosphere, but Cordelia had stood firm in her commitment to make amends. "I learned something important that day," she explained to a reporter from the Washington Times. "I learned that heroism doesn't always look the way we expect it to. Sometimes it looks like a wounded veteran struggling to find his place in the world. Sometimes it looks like an elderly woman standing up for what's right. Sometimes it looks like a federal agent willing to use his position to defend someone who can't defend himself." The ripple effects extended far beyond the cafe walls. Margot Blackwood, the elderly woman who had spoken up in Zeke's defense, had become something of a local celebrity herself. Her story of a Marine husband who had struggled with his own demons after returning from Vietnam had resonated with many families who had faced similar challenges. She had used her newfound platform to advocate for better mental health services for veterans, drawing on her own experiences of watching her husband battle invisible wounds for decades. Her testimony before a congressional subcommittee on veteran affairs had been both heartbreaking and inspiring, detailing the long-term effects of combat trauma on families and communities. "My husband Harold never talked about Vietnam," she told the assembled legislators. "He carried those memories alone for 43 years until the day he died. We can't let another generation of veterans suffer in silence. We owe them more than just our gratitude. We owe them our support, our understanding, and our commitment to helping them heal." The congressional hearing had been prompted partly by the attention generated by Zeke's story. Representative Maria Santos, a former Army officer herself, had seized on the momentum to push for increased funding for veteran mental health services and job training programs. The Morrison incident, as it's come to be known, highlights a fundamental disconnect between how we honor our veterans in the abstract and how we treat them in practice, she said during the hearing. "We put up monuments and hold parades, but we don't always recognize the heroes walking among us every day." Chen, meanwhile, had been working behind the scenes to ensure that Zeke's story reached the right people. His position in the Secret Service had given him access to influential figures in government and the private sector, and he had been leveraging those connections to create opportunities for meaningful change. He had arranged for Zeke to meet with the Secretary of Veterans Affairs, a conversation that had led to Zeke being invited to join an advisory committee on veteran services. The committee was tasked with making recommendations for improving the transition process for service members returning to civilian life. "Your experience is unfortunately not unique," the secretary had told Zeke during their meeting. "Too many veterans struggle with the transition from military to civilian life, and too few receive the support they need. Your willingness to share your story publicly has opened doors that we've been trying to open for years." The advisory committee work had given Zeke a sense of purpose that he hadn't felt since leaving the military. For the first time in years, he felt like he was making a difference, contributing to something larger than himself. The meetings were held twice a month, bringing together veterans from different branches of service, different conflicts, and different backgrounds, all united by their shared experience of struggle and resilience. One of the committee's first recommendations had been the establishment of a national awareness campaign about veteran issues. The campaign, dubbed Recognize the Hero, focused on educating the public about the challenges faced by returning veterans and encouraging communities to create more inclusive environments. Zeke had been chosen as one of the campaign's primary spokespeople, a role that required him to travel across the country, sharing his story and advocating for better veteran services. The speaking engagements were challenging at first, standing in front of crowds of strangers, exposing his vulnerabilities and traumas, reliving painful memories for the sake of education and awareness. But with each speech, each interview, each conversation with a fellow veteran who had faced similar struggles, Zeke felt himself growing stronger. The isolation that had defined his civilian life was being replaced by a sense of community and purpose. He was no longer just a disabled veteran struggling to find his place in the world. He was an advocate, a voice for those who couldn't speak for themselves. The transformation wasn't just personal, it was professional as well. Several companies had reached out to Zeke after hearing his story, offering him employment opportunities that recognized his leadership skills and military experience. After months of rejections and dismissals, he suddenly found himself in the position of choosing between multiple job offers. He had ultimately accepted a position with a non-profit organization that provided job training and placement services for veterans. The work was challenging but fulfilling, allowing him to use his own experiences to help other veterans navigate the transition to civilian life. His colleagues, many of whom were veterans themselves, understood the challenges he had faced and respected the journey he had taken. The nonprofit's offices were located just 3 blocks from Rosewood Café, and Zeke had made it a habit to stop by for coffee most mornings before work. The irony wasn't lost on him. The place that had once made him feel unwelcome had become a regular part of his daily routine. Cordelia always greeted him with a warm smile and a genuine inquiry about his day. The other staff members had come to know him as a regular customer, and many of the other patrons had become familiar faces. The businessman, who had initially looked at him with disdain, now nodded respectfully when their paths crossed. The woman in the Chanel suit had even introduced herself and asked about his advocacy work. But perhaps the most meaningful change had been in his relationship with Margot Blackwood. The elderly woman had become something of a surrogate grandmother to him, and their Tuesday morning coffee meetings had become a cherished ritual. She would share stories of her late husband's military service, while Zeke would update her on his advocacy work and speaking engagements. "You know," she had told him during one of their conversations, "Harold would have been so proud of what you're doing. He always said that the real battle for veterans began when they came home. You're fighting that battle not just for yourself, but for all of them." The recognition and platform that had come from his experience at the cafe had given Zeke something he had been searching for since leaving the military: a mission. The work was far from over, and the challenges faced by veterans were complex and systemic, but for the first time in years, he felt like he was making a difference, contributing to positive change and honoring the service of his fellow veterans. As he prepared to take the stage at the Kennedy Center, Zeke reflected on the journey that had brought him to this moment. A simple desire for coffee and human connection had led to a confrontation that had changed not just his life, but the lives of countless others. The story that had begun with discrimination and rejection had become one of recognition, advocacy, and hope. The transformation reminded him that sometimes the most important battles are fought not on foreign soil, but in our own communities, in our own hearts, and in our own willingness to see the humanity in others. It was a lesson that extended far beyond veteran affairs, touching on fundamental questions of dignity, respect, and the recognition that heroes come in all forms and deserve to be treated with the honor they have earned.